great news. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for taking your time to join us today for Michael Gonzalez seminar. It's our great honor and pleasure to have Michael Gonzalez with us this afternoon. Please welcome Mike Gonzalez. Also, please welcome Ken Xu, a Chinese-American student intern from the Heritage Foundation. Welcome, Ken. Thank you, Ken. Next, I would like to introduce our VIP guests, Laura Harrison and Adam Pettis. Laurie was the Maryland Board of Education and the Montgomery County PTA leader. She's running for state delegate for District 15. And Adam Petty was a science teacher in middle school and high school in MCPS for many, many years. And this year, he's running for county council for District 2. Welcome. Thank you very much for coming. Now, before I start to introduce our keynote speaker, I would like to ask you all a quick question. How many of you have heard the Heritage Foundation? Please raise your hand. Wow, great, thank you. So the Heritage Foundation is a research institute and conservative think tank that has considerable influence on national public policy in the United States. For those who don't know Michael Gonzalez, he is a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation. One of his top research interests is identity politics. So today, Mike will discuss during his talk about how identity politics was given approval through the census and other government paperwork. Also, how the identity politics is encouraged through racial preferences in school admissions. Also, why we should take it seriously as an attempt to dismantle liberal democracy. So now, finally, it's your turn, Mike. Everybody, please welcome Mike.
Thank you. Thank you very much for showing up. Thank you, Eva, for that. I'm going to, by the way, I'm not checking the Croatia-Russia game. What I'm doing is I'm trying to time myself. I'm a big believer that if you speak for much longer than 25 minutes or a half hour, you begin to lose the audience. And I'm also going to drink a lot of water, so I apologize in advance for that. And this is great that so many of you have turned out here on a Saturday. I know that you're committed parents. I have children myself. There are many things you could be doing on a beautiful day after so many hot days. We finally have a beautiful day, and yet you're here with me. So I'm very humbled by that. But I'm also very happy to be here to speak with fellow Americans who are, like me, worried about the kind of nation that will leave their children. And what kind of nation our children will inherit. And I think it's because you're parents that you have taken an interest in this. So first, I will tell you what I will not say. I'm not going to talk about the school system or what to do with your local politicians, because I have communicated with many of you, and I know how well you know this issue better than I do. And I talk to a lot of Chinese American leaders across the country, and they know these things much better than I do. I'm not a politician. I do policy. I do research policy, as Eva said. I write about it and make recommendations to policymakers, but mainly I write about it. I publish papers. There are copies of one of my most recent paper published last week with Hans von Spokowski on this issue, and what this paper recommends, it's about 6,000 words, so maybe it's a bit too much, but is that we should get rid of groups based on ethnicity, and that we should get rid of, the government should be out of the business of handing out privileges and benefits on the basis of race. That is, as I said to Fox in Baltimore a couple of days ago, the government should not be doing this in the year of 2018. So what I will do today is put in a historical context why some kids are not getting into school, that they deserve because of their academic accomplishments and because of their extracurricular activities. I will speak a little bit about the issues surrounding the recent lawsuit against Harvard, and after I speak for about 25 minutes longer, we can have a question and answer period. So in my talk, I will try to explain three things. First, how identity politics emerged. Second, how racial preferences in school play a role in that. And third, why it matters to us as Americans and to the country. I want to start by discussing the terminology. One of the things that is really annoying to people who write and talk and read about these issues is that there isn't really an agreement on what the terms mean. I'm going to be very precise about what they mean as I try to be precise in my writings. Now, we all have some idea, but then we disagree. So I will tell you what I mean by these terms. You will hear me talk a lot about identity politics. Now, what is that? It's one of the central issues of my research, and I will discuss it a lot today. And by identity politics, I mean the breakup of the nation into groups that are adversarial, that are set against each other, fighting, vying for resources. And they're composed mostly along the lines of self-identifying based on race, ethnicity, sex, or sexual orientation. America, like any other nation since biblical time, is composed of many different tribes, but we have all had something together. These tribes all have a sense of shared destiny, and that is what I worry about, that could be breaking up. In that sense, you will hear me also speak about multiculturalism, which is related. It's also a danger, I think. And I don't pretend that America is composed of only one ethnic group. That is, of course, a folly. From the start in the 1600s already, we were already multi-ethnic. America has always been multi-ethnic. The difference today is that some people want to pretend that we don't have a single unifying culture, but we have many competing ones, and the only thing that unites us is respect for each other's difference. I believe that adherence to a new system, a new model, multiculturalism, could disunite the United States, and I think that is dangerous. I will also speak about affirmative action, but I will refer to it by its proper name, racial preferences, that's what it is. And by that I mean how government gives benefits and privileges to members of some identity groups and not others. You may be mostly concerned about about racial preferences in admissions to K through 12 or university, but it happens at all levels. It happens by loans to small businesses. It happens in employment. It happens throughout America. Parenthetically, you have heard two things in the news recently. One is that Justice Anthony Kennedy has retired. He had a long, respected career. I respected Anthony Kennedy a lot. I met him once in Hong Kong, actually. He came and spoke there. Many people are saying that whoever gets appointed will have an impact on how these issues are solved in the future. That is very foolhardy. I have followed the court for many decades. Nobody can predict how a justice will react, how a justice will judge on a case. David Souter was appointed by, I think, George H.W. Bush, and turned out to be very liberal on many issues. Senator Dave O'Connor tended to make liberal decisions as well. So don't listen to the news about, nobody knows. This new person has not been nominated yet by the president, nor has it been confirmed by the Senate. The second news, the one that you had me on there on Fox News, is that President Trump has rescinded Obama-era guidance on racial preferences, and there were two guidances, and I read them. They were between 2011 and 2016, and one was K through 12, and the other one was secondary, post-secondary education. And that is really good news. That is unadulterated good news that Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, has done this, has rescinded these guidance. President Obama extended himself, as he was wont to do many times during his presidency. And even the New York Times said that the guidelines had, quote unquote, bent the law. But what I want to make clear is, despite the rescission of these guidance, the use of affirmative action and racial preferences is still deemed to be constitutional, and will be so until it comes up in the court again. And that much I'm pretty sure I can predict, that it will come up in a court case again. So lastly, let me explain diversity. It is another contentious term, and I will explain to you what I mean by that. I like diversity. I love diversity. I love diversity of thought, especially, and I love diversity of opinion. I like to explain to people that I was born in Cuba to two Spanish immigrant grandparents, that I married to a woman born in Scotland whom I love very much, who was raised in Scotland, to Northern Irish parents, and she herself feels her origin is in Ireland. Two of my children were born in Belgium. The other one was born in New York. I have lived all over the world. I lived in Asia for 10 years, 10 of them in Hong Kong. So I really understand diversity, multi-ethnicity, and all these issues. Where I think we get in trouble is when we pursue diversity, which means a perfect statistical proportion of the base population everywhere from classroom to the court, to the legislatures, to the office. Diversity was the word used in the first affirmative action case in 1978, and it is a very important word. So now let me dive in. How did all these things come to signify so much and tear us apart so much? And believe me, these issues are really, they've entered the military, they've entered corporate America, they've entered every facet of our lives. I have had the opportunity to meet with a member of the military recently and said, look, you really have to make sure that this does not begin to enter into the military manuals. So a lot of people say that all of this stems from the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965. As many of you will know, in 1924, immigration was severely restricted by law. Many immigrants had come through Ellis Island starting in the 1890s, in 1890 actually. So for 25 years, we had millions of immigrants, and there was a nativist backlash. Immigration was shut off, and the number was severely limited of people who could immigrate. The Sicilians, the Poles, the Greeks, the Syrians, the Armenians, the East Europeans, Jews, Russians. That was severely restricted, and as you know very well, probably, Chinese and Koreans and Japanese could not come at all as a result of laws and agreements that were passed. I believe there was an agreement between Teddy Roosevelt and the Emperor of Japan that also restricted the immigration, actually just completely shut it down from these countries, and limited from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. So this law did have an impact, the naturalization law of 1965. But I think, and I will argue today, that it was the two other acts, the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65, were far more important to the formation of identity politics, not to immigration, which I really have very little to say about, but to the formation of identity politics. And the way these two acts were twisted was what was the result of that is what we're seeing today. Now, these two acts, I have to always emphasize, were really necessary, and they were beautiful. They were beautiful acts. Many of our co-citizens, Americans of African descent, were denied their rights, were denied their rights to vote, were denied their rights to even ride in the front of the bus, eat in the lunch counter of their choice. They were denied from participating in society, and they were and having the equal opportunity. So these acts were necessary. So these two acts, the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, were enacted to correct all these wrongs, to finish the work that Lincoln had begun with the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil War itself. And one of the most beautiful things about this period, and I read about it a lot, is that it sought a colorblind society. It sought colorblind justice. As the Reverend Martin Luther King, MLK, who is really kind of one of the founding fathers, even though he was not of the generation of 1776, as he said on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on the Mall in 1963, quote, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." All of that was betrayed, in my opinion, and that quote must be of some kind of bitter irony to you, given what is happening in Harvard and Princeton and the other Ivy League schools. You're nodding your head. You agree. I will come back to this quote. Now, I believe that promise was betrayed within a handful of years after the act were passed. The vision that won was not the vision of MLK, but rather the separatist model that was really the thoughts of Malcolm X, especially in his early years. So the belief that won was that ending separate treatment and enacting colorblind laws and regulations should not be the goals of the civil rights movement. This was based on a separate ideology. This vision contended that members of groups that had been repressed were incapable of success by assimilating into society. It was held that they could not assimilate, and above all, that they should not choose to assimilate. If they did assimilate as individuals, they would only perpetuate a bad American system, a system that had to be destroyed. The champions of this vision argued that the American system, the American way of life, had been rotten from the start and had to be replaced with something entirely different. All of American society had to be dismantled and changed completely. Many of your children, when they take AP, and I know they will, APUSH, they will read, because I know that, because I know from personal experience, they will read Howard Zinn, a historian. Look for that, Howard Zinn, Z-I-N-N. It's taught every day. It's the best-selling book in Amazon on American politics, American history, and that's exactly what he teaches, that all of this is very corrupt. And by the way, that was very bad, very shoddy scholarship that Howard Zinn practiced. So according to the purveyors of this vision, this struggle could also not be left only to African Americans, but instead other collectivities, other collectives had to be created, which had to be constructed on the basis of self-identity, and generally centered on race, ethnicity, and sex. And that's when the term minority began to refer especially to oppressed groups, including racial and ethnic groups, as well as women. Now, it may come as a surprise to you that minorities had not been used that way until mid-century. If you look at an American dictionary in the 40s and 50s, it talks about minorities in terms of political minorities. But there was also another sense of minorities in Europe, the ethnic minorities that lived in these large empires, the Ottoman Empire, the Austrian Empire, the Russian Empire, and they were considered to be subnational groups that were separatist. And in fact, most of American people who commented on this were quite negative about this separatism and this rise of nationalism. But the term minority, as we know it, only started being used in the American dictionaries in the 60s. So all these groups were added on the basis of self-identity. Later, we've added other groups like the physically handicapped, members of one religion only, which is Islam. It's the religion that is seen as oppressed. So that is one of the members of the oppressed groups. And they all were deemed to be subservient to and marginalized by mainstream society. Now, the members of these groups had to accept their status as marginalized in society, had to recognize their victimhood, and that victimhood entitled them to government help. Now, that's not how I see myself, whatever, and I imagine that many of you are aspiring to that status, and who would ever aspire to that? So that gave to the identity politics of today. It held that individuals that are disadvantaged must compete collectively, not as individuals. In other words, you have rights not as individuals, not as individual Americans, but as members of group. You have collective rights and privileges. Ethnic collectives must be organized, even if they're artificial, and a lot of times they're artificial. So that implies that you don't have individuals' thoughts, that what you have is collective thoughts and perspectives. So you don't have, the thoughts that you have are not because of who you are. You have the same thoughts as her and him and everybody. And these groups, by the way, were not based on anything, were not based on anthropology. People as different as Chinese, Indians, Japanese, Pakistanis, Filipinos, and Laotians were lumped together under the umbrella term Asians. People as different as Mexicans, Argentines, Dominicans, Bolivians, and Cubans were lumped together as Hispanics, and that was put into the census in 1980, but it really began to be crafted in 1970, in the mid-70s, when the advisory committees to the census were created in 1974, starting in 1974. Now, why am I going on about all this? Because it is on this very idea, on this body of thought, that racial preferences in education, the issue that you care greatly about, but I want to put it in the proper context. That's where it comes into being, that anybody benefits from the perspectives of all groups, and they have to be reflected in the classroom. Now, in 1978, the Supreme Court issued a decision that affirmed the rights of universities and schools to use race and ethnicity as a proper criteria in admissions. That case was Regents of the University of California versus Bakke, known as the Bakke decision, B-A-K-K-E, or simply as Bakke. It held that the goal of diversity was, quote, sufficiently compelling, unquote, for race to be considered in admissions. Even more striking than that was the conclusion in 2003, Grutter versus Bollinger, where the court determined that, quote, educational benefits that flow from an ethnically diverse student body, unquote, represented a, quote, compelling state interest that justified the use of race in admissions. Now, that Bollinger today is Lee Bollinger, the president of Columbia. He was then in Michigan, and when I was in Hong Kong, I was a member of the Columbia Alumni Club, and he came, and I was invited, and we were seated next to, I was seated next to him at dinner, and we spent the whole night arguing. And I would say, look, you're the president of my university, but you were wrong. You were wrong in Bollinger, in Grutter versus Bollinger. So that phrase, educational benefits that flow from an ethnically diverse student body, that is nothing but benign, right? As American as apple pie. No, I want to tell you that when you analyze it, when you consider its impact, it contains some implications that are troubling, and you shouldn't just blithely accept this as mother's love and apple pie. This concept is behind why some children are kept out of the schools when their grades and achievements qualify them for admission, but it is also very unfair to the children who are accepted, in whose name racial preferences and affirmative action are practiced. Let's turn to the concept of a diverse student body and what it means to a group that amounts for only 5.6% of the population, such as, for example, Asian Americans. What you seek is diversity in education for diversity's sake, then the proportion of the Asian student body in a given class cannot stray too far from 5.6. An Asian student body population of over 50% at UC San Diego and UC Irvine is not very diverse, nor would an Asian population at Harvard at 43% be very diverse. And yet, according to a study that Harvard itself conducted in 2013, and this came out when the motion for summary judgment was filed in Boston on June 15th, according to a study that Harvard itself conducted, that would be the percentage of the student population that would be Asian if academic achievements were the only criteria used in admissions. So in other words, any system that seeks diversity as an end in itself will devolve into group proportionalism and therefore quotas. Now the Supreme Court in Bakke decided that quotas are not constitutional. When the Harvard case comes to court in Boston District Court on October 15th, we will see whether or not what Harvard has been doing is engaging in that unconstitutional practice. The case will be very likely to end up in the Supreme Court, where a new justice replacing Anthony Kennedy will be sitting. If you have read the case, and I have written about it a lot, and Kenny Xu has put out some of the copies of my articles for the Hill newspaper on this issue, it becomes very clear that, in my mind, Harvard was gaming the system to obtain quotas by another name. Now, this has happened before. In the 1920s, Harvard equally did not want to allow in many Jews. The president of Harvard at the time, I believe his name was Abbott Lowell, he recognized that saying we're going to have a quota for Jews would not be a very good look. So he said this: let's look for qualities that are most associated with Gentiles and grant admission based on those qualities. To keep down the number of Asian students in the name of diversity, Harvard is doing something that to me looks very similar. It is impossible to game the system when it comes to academic achievements or extracurricular activities. After all, people have the GPA that they have the SAT score that they have the number of AP courses that they have passed. Similarly, when it comes to extracurricular activities, you have the hours, right? This is all very objective stuff. You have the hours that you have put into charity or the swim team. Or personal traits. Personal traits are in the eye of the beholder. Characteristics such as courage, sense of humor, leadership, these cannot be objectively measured. So it is through subjective assessment of these personal characteristics that Asian applicants are being discriminated against. That's the case. That's the crux of the case at Harvard. Now, this is obviously nauseating and revolting. And if we go back to that lady who was shaken when I was reading Martin Luther King, if you go back to what he said, I have a dream that my 4 little children will live and will not be judged by the color of the skin, but by the content of their character. That beautiful sentiment is being turned upside down. Again, it's nauseating. It's also untrue. You in this room have amply demonstrated amazing qualities of leadership, courage, and civic engagement. But again, this is what I want to emphasize. This is the kind of outcome, it can only be the outcome if you get out and you set out to create a, quote, an ethnically diverse student body, as called for in Grutter. But consider, now we talked about what it does to one group of the population. Consider what it does to the children of the groups in whose name this is put into practice. There are 3 harms that I will discuss with you. The first one is mismatch theory. You have heard of this a lot, probably, which holds that if you throw a kid without the academic background, without the preparation, into a very competitive environment at a very selective school, he or she will feel very discouraged, will then likely drop out of school altogether, or switch the major from a STEM field or law into the humanities, because humanities are easier. And you end up having fewer doctors or fewer scientists of certain groups. To me, the other 2 harms are even worse. The second one is that if you belong to a group in whose name racial preferences are carried out, all your life, all of your achievements and credentials will be questioned by people, even if they don't say it to you, by people who will think you got into Columbia or you got into Princeton because of your last name or because of the group you belong to. That will be really insulting to you, especially if you worked your butt out, especially if you stayed at home and did your homework, if you didn't go to the parties, if you had foregone socializing, and you got in by the sweat of your brow, to all of your life have your credentials be questioned, is really, again, as I said on Fox, not something that should be happening in America today. And you yourself may come to question yourself, what if I got in to Harvard because of my last name? And that will be awful, because all of the data shows that you only enjoy earned success. You only enjoy that shiny red car if you earned it by working for it. But if you bought that shiny red car with an inheritance you received from your mother or your father, or because you won the money in the lottery, you actually don't end up enjoying that car as much. And that we have ample research to show that. Arthur Brooks at the American Enterprise Institute has written a whole book on it. But the third harm is even worse. If there are educational benefits to be derived from an ethnically diverse student body, then 2 things must be true. The first is that you're there for the benefit of some kid from Greenwich who is learning from your perspective so he can go out and lead the world. So you're there as an educational prop. But the other two, the second thing that must be true is that you're there as an ambassador of your group, as someone who thinks like everyone else, who will have a perspective from that group, and that you will then share it in the classroom. You're not there as an individual, and if you get into Harvard on the racial preferences because you tick the box, then you accepted a Faustian bargain that you will reflect and share with others the perspectives of your group. A group that may have been assigned to you arbitrarily by the bureaucracy in the first place. Makes no sense. So racial preferences suborn you to tick the box. It surreptitiously incite you to embrace an identity that, as I said, again, could have been arbitrarily assigned to you. That's why I called racial preferences and affirmative action the gateway drug of identity politics. Now, if this is beginning to sound familiar to those of you raised under communism, especially the Maoist variety, it should. This is Marxism, this is cultural Marxism, which brings me to my third and final point, and I'm sure you're happy that we're going to the final point. Now, earlier on I explained how the whole thing started and how the theorists of this brand new school of thought thought the American system had to completely be replaced and overhauled, and the American way of life had to be changed. This school goes by many names. One of them is critical theory, and it is associated with a group of German scientists who immigrated from Germany, who fled Germany after the Second World War and came here, became very influential. They became very influential, especially in the Ivies. Many of the people who were advising the census at the time that these groups were created had been influenced by these people, and in fact, if you, as I have, if you go to their thesis and you look at the footnotes, you see the people who are quoting belong to this group of academics who came here in the 50s and 40s. And in fact, many of the people who are advising the census today in the national advisory committees are themselves critical theorists at universities and have been influenced by this kind of thinking. What all of this is trying to do is tear down liberal democracy and rewrite the existing social contract. And now this is not hyperbole, it is not me saying so. If you read the papers of the people who have thought this, you will see they say it in black and white, they don't hide themselves. If you want to read these papers, I'll be very happy to share titles with you. I warn you, they don't make for easy reading. They're kind of turgid and terse, amazingly dense. Why does that matter? Let me explain to you the genesis of liberal democracy. So you say, well, why, something that was started in Britain in the 1600s, who cares? That's what we inherited here in America is the philosophy of John Locke especially, and it holds that all individuals are held politically equal as a fact of nature and are free to pursue their survival and protect their interests. They have natural rights, such as, for example, the right to property, life, and liberty, and which have a foundation that is independent, a foundation in nature which is independent of government. And now it is their interest in preserving natural rights that drives them to form a social contract with each other and give consent to a political authority who will protect their rights. Why is this important? Because the founders founded America on these notions, and all institutions are based on these notions. They wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that governments are instituted to secure these rights. The Constitution puts it slightly different, says that governments are instituted to secure the blessings of liberty. It's the same idea. What the proponents of identity politics want to do is almost the exact opposite. They want to change the system, and what they say is that this system, liberal democracy, they say this, cannot address the structural marginalization of members of groups that are discriminated against. And I don't impugn people's motives. I come at it, okay, convince me. Let me read what you're saying and trying to convince me. So they say that supposedly neutral individual of liberal democracy, that supposedly neutral individual that John Locke thought of, is actually a white, male, and heterosexual, and that attempts to apply those norms of liberal democracy of equality will risk demanding that members who are not male or white or heterosexual have to conform to the identity of the oppressor. Let me just quote from Sonia Crook at Oberlin College, one of the hothouses of identity politics. She said, quote, "The demand is not for inclusion within the fold of universal humankind on the basis of shared human attributes, nor is it for respect in spite of one's differences. Rather, what is demanded is respect for oneself as different." These members of society say that those of us who seek to work within the system, like I do, and I suspect many of you do by studying hard and taking tests and actually succeeding because that works, you are guilty of quote-unquote false consciousness. And false consciousness can only be cured through consciousness raising and consciousness raising sessions. Now, if that sounds familiar to you, it should, because Maoist re-education camps and Castro's re-education camps really are just a step or two steps beyond that. It is not, it's just part of the same body of thought. That is not what I want for my children. I do not want to pass to my children this model, and that's what I do, the things that I do when I write, the things that I write and why I'm here on a Saturday speaking with you. I didn't come to America to tear down America. My family came here because it offered my family hope. It offers us hope that we could flee. There was this escape hatch we could take and come to a place of freedom. And America has fulfilled that promise. That promise has been kept for me. And that's what I want to leave to my children, a nation of freedom. And I certainly don't want them to have to live, or anybody, your kids, anybody, to have to live with this nonsense anymore. So I've just given you my explanation as to, because I know that you're very caught up in your own world and what is happening to you in K through 12, and I have said nothing to you about this, but what I hope I have done is put it in the context. How does it fit? How does it fit into a greater context, and what is happening to the America that you have come to, or you have given, where your children have been born, and I hope I've been able to at least explain myself. Now, I've gone 33 minutes, longer than I should have, but now I'll end here and take your questions. And thank you for being such a good audience. Eva, how do you want to do this? You want to pick questions, or you want me to do it myself? I'm quite capable.
Go ahead, please. Yeah, anybody want to ask the questions? I'm sure after listening to his talk, you might have questions. Please, we have up to 30 minutes.
Whatever you want. I mean, I have many questions people have. You don't have to agree with me. My wife never agrees with me, and so I'm quite used to it. Anybody who has a question? Yeah, you, sir, right here. Is there a microphone?
Oh, I don't think I need one. Is this loud enough? Yes.
I think it's being taped.
The people who have kind of built this edifice you've been talking about, this new way of thinking, do you have anything to say about how best to counter it in a way, politically or otherwise?
Politically, I can't talk about politics. Policy, I've made myself very clear that we have to get race out of the census. We have to get away from these groups. You know, you're Americans. You know, you may have been born, you're Americans. You know, even if you were not born here, if you're naturalized, to me, you're Americans. And to the law, you're Americans. So get these groups out of the census, get these groups out of surveys, get rid of these groups. It is perfectly reasonable to ask objective questions like we used to ask before. You know, where were you born? What language do you speak at home? In fact, there was an argument in 1970 with Conrad Tauber, and I forget Roberto Gnizda, I think it was a member of MALDEF, in which he said, well, you're not counting Mexican Americans right. And he said, well, here, I'll tell you what I'm counting. I'm counting people who have these last names, and I'm counting people who were born in Mexico, and I'm counting what language they speak at home. And this was done in 5 southwestern states. And what the proponents of identity politics said, no. We want you to get away from these objective measurements, and we want you to count on self-identity. And as I explained to people, if you put on a pith helmet and you want to find the mouth of the Yellow River of identity politics, you come at this moment. Because what they wanted was self-identity. They wanted the census and the government to measure self-identity. And then, after the identity group was created, teach them to identify that way. So I think that is not by all means the only thing we have to do. But we need to get started there. And I will leave it this way. I often say, identity politics, is it like a forest fire in which you don't care how it was started by a cigarette that was not put out correctly, or a picnic table, or is it more like a factory poisoning a river, where the first thing you do is you shut down the factory, and then you clean out the river, and you clean out the algae, and you clean out the fish. And I think identity politics is more the latter. You get the government out of it, and then you start doing many other things, but we need to shut down the factory. Right there, ma'am. Yeah, in the red. I think there's a microphone. No, I don't think it's working. Just shout. There you go.
I would like you to explain something that I do not know. I agree with what you're saying about the census. Could you tell me exactly who decides what gets put on the census? I know there's lots of discussion of what should and should not be in. Who decides that? Because I have no idea. I did work once as a numerator going door to door.
Oh, did you?
Yes.
Thank you. I have a three-letter answer, OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. It has been given to them because of the Paperwork Act, and they decide what gets into the census. It was OMB Directive number 15 in 1977 that said, these are the groups. These are the groups, and these groups are going to be the groups for all of America. And we, in my field, have always called it the ethno-racial pentagon, because it's got a catchy phrase to it, but it's no longer a pentagon because Asian, Pacific Islanders and Hawaiians broke off in 1997, and in the 2000 census is now really more of a hexagon. There was Obama wanted to create yet one more group for Middle East, North Africa. I argued strenuously against this idea, and my opinion is so far winning, but you never know, right? The founder of the Heritage Foundation, Ed Fulmer, always says, in Washington there are no permanent victories, no permanent defeats, so you always have to keep on fighting. But it is the Office of Management and Budget.
Okay, if it's the Office of Management and Budget, because I know that's a big office. I was in the government, I know about bureaucracy. I mean, who exactly? I mean, they get directions from someone. So
Well, they get directions from...
the demands already that are there, so they don't have a choice. And I mean, OMB is a huge place.
So they get directions from many places. So you're pushing me. OIRA, within OMB, OIRA, the Office of Information and Research, I forget what it is. Look at it, OIRA, O-I-R-A. Within OMB, OIRA is in charge of this, of the groups. But it's not really right to say it's all OMB and it's all OIRA, because the Justice Department has a lot to say about it, the Congress has a lot to say about it, the administration has a lot to say about it.
That was my question.
Yeah, think tanks have a lot to say about it. So we live in a democracy where there's an exchange of ideas, and obviously on the other side you have the National Advisory Committees, which have a huge sway. It's completely taken over by leftist groups, and they have a lot to say about what happens. They're kind of fighting what Trump is trying to do.
Thank you.
Sir, there in the back with the red shirt.
Mr. Gonzalez, I really agree with you on a lot of points, but I just want to play a little bit devil's advocate.
Oh, please do.
Yeah.
Yes.
Push back a little bit.
By the way, don't be the devil's advocate. That's a bad thing. Be your own advocate, right?
Okay, be my own advocate.
Tell me what you think.
I agree with you that the political left probably overplayed the identity politics. But on the other hand, because of historic reasons, you have to agree that there are certain race, certain group of people are disadvantaged.
Right.
And we are the society, as a society, I believe we should give a helping hand to the disadvantaged people. So certain institutional policy or government policy favoring, give certain consideration, favorable consideration to the disadvantaged group of people, I think it's warranted. The ideal of living in a color-blind society is very good and well, but we are not living in that society. And there is still a lot of discrimination, stereotypes out there. We are living in right now, right? So I would say that my pushback is if we eliminate all race-based policies, what we end up will be the final outcome would be the perpetuation of white privilege and the dominant white advantage.
Right.
So that's the pushback.
What is your first name?
My name is Paul Lee.
Paul, it's like you. You agreed with a lot of what I said. I agree with a lot of what you say. And I think that, obviously, we needed the Civil Rights Act. Anybody who thinks that we didn't need it is crazy. We needed to get rid of institutionalized racism, which is what we had. Where I disagree with you is in asking government to then overcompensate by being racist in the other way, by using race for preferences in the other way. Now, these decisions by the Supreme Court, Bakke and Grutter and Fisher 1 and Fisher 2, and there are others for K through 12, they have actually really created a very small space for government to use race. It says it has to be, these programs cannot be quotas. These programs, these remedies have to be narrowly tailored, and that they have to be constantly scrutinized. The only prediction I made today is that it was going to come back to the court, because even Kennedy, I think he wrote the decision in Fisher 2, in which he said, this has to be very narrowly tailored. And so we need to be constantly looking at it. And even there, that devolved into the case at Harvard. As constrained as that was, it developed into what's happening at Harvard. I would disagree with you that white privilege is a complete obstacle to success in this country. I think there's definitely, there is a privilege to being white, but it doesn't, that is not an obstacle to success. Many people here have succeeded who are not white. If you study hard and you apply yourself, and if you, don't go to the party, you really can succeed. Evil will never be, we're going to live with evil for the rest of our lives. That's going to be, the devil is always going to be there. I happen to be religious, and many of you are not, but the devil is always going to be there. Evil will always be there. Racism will always be there. What we have to do is make sure the government pursues it very carefully, and every time a racist act has been committed, somebody has not been gotten into a school because of race, somebody has not been hired because of race, that is prosecuted. And that is, I do believe that Martin Luther King's dream is what I want to have. Now, why we turned, when we got there in the late 60s, why we turned so quickly against it is, to me, one of the greatest and sad ironies. Have I answered your question?
Yeah, I would say that the biggest, right now, just use the Harvard example. I think the biggest obstacle is not how many Africans, Latinos they admit. I mean, Asians represents 22% of Harvard admission. That's more representative of the population. It's clearly.
You should be thinking of those terms, though.
No, they're not pursuing, proportional to population. Clearly, they're not pursuing that.
Right.
I think what we should go after is the legacy admission. That's the most outrageous. That's clear.
And that's the argument that the left always makes. It happens to be wrong. In Harvard's own study, even if you continue having legacies and athletic special admissions, Asians would still rise to 33, 34%. And so all that is doing is changing the subject. I agree with you, and I think some of the universities in California have gotten away from all this. But even if you continue, according to Harvard's own study, if you continue legacies and athletic scholarships, the Ivy League does not grant scholarships, but if you continue to pay special attention to athletes, as Harvard does, you would still have 33%. Anybody else? Ma'am, right there with a hat.
Thank you. Well, I don't know where to start. My name is Tessie Harris, and I'm off the reservation. You didn't get into much about group think. When you're divided into a group, if you get outside the group, you are as attacked and vilified as any, I'm sorry, if you get out of the group, you're attacked and vilified as any privileged soul. And I just like a couple of minutes. One, you talked about, I don't know who it was that talked about helping poor and downtrodden. Fine. However, the problem is there is helping somebody to stand up, a helping hand, not a handout. I'm going to give you a personal story. My father was blue collar, janitor. My mother was a waitress. They sent 4 children to college. Between the 4 of us, we have 8 degrees. Okay? We worked during the summer. We worked part-time while we were in school. And we weren't asking, yes, we got scholarships, we got loans, and we paid them on, unlike those today who don't want to. One other thing I would like to say on a positive note is that this business here again of helping, it's not helping someone when you tell them, oh, you can't do it. You can't. And so what you got is, you just said, people who are going into schools that they aren't prepared for. That is not helping you. So why do you think we got those riots on campuses? It's because those kids are in there, they can't perform, and therefore they attack. Last comment, which is on a positive note. There are a number of blacks who are rejecting the identity politics. I'm going to give you, Yes, I'm going to give you the name of one book. It's called Please Stop Helping Us.
Yeah.
Okay. And
Jason, right?
Yes, Jason.
Yeah, Jason and I were colleagues at the Wall Street Journal.
Right, exactly. And what he's saying talks about in there is how whites